My name is Axel. Hello. It is an honor to be here with you all today during this architecture week. This is a school that I have admired so much from afar, and having worked with many of its former students, tutors, and various protagonists over the years, it's such a pleasure to meet you all, or to have met you all and continue to meet you all over this week and spend time with you and your work. It's been a truly inspiring experience already, and I know only continue over the coming days. During this lecture, I'm going to do two things. First, I'm going to introduce e-flux architecture, the editorial platform and archive that I've been running over the past 9, almost 10. We started in the same year as the GSA years. I will introduce you to how the platform works, as well as what kind of stuff we do, sharing a handful of projects. I will then zoom into one particular project, the Chronograms of Architecture project, which, as Guy mentioned, we will be bringing to Johannesburg and the GSA as an exhibition next June. Before I start, I want to thank the people who have made it possible and have brought me here. Firstly, to Mark Raymond and Heidi Liu for shepherding this exhibition project into the school, and to Guy, to Denise, to Leslie, to Mello, and to Gabby for supporting us along the way. And I finally want to thank Bongisa for my fit tonight. Thank you very much. So, to start, what is e-flux architecture? I actually got a glimpse into your curriculum earlier today, and I got an insight. Actually, some of you might be familiar with e-flux architecture. Some essays that we published over the years have made its way into your curriculum, but still, what is e-flux architecture? So it is, as I mentioned, it's an editorial project and it's an archive founded in 2016. Now, we are based around a website, and everything we publish is available for free. But we are also a mailing list. We actually started out as a mailing list. We are arguably more of a mailing list than a website. I mean, okay, maybe not, but let me back up a little bit and give you like an origin story. So e-flux architecture, as I mentioned, was founded in 2016. e-flux architecture is a part of e-flux, which is a wider editorial platform website. We have a number of different divisions. We publish content about film, about education, but primarily about art, about contemporary art. Now, e-flux as a whole started out in 1999 and became prominent because it was actually the first time, it was the first place, the first people that used email to disseminate news about an exhibition opening. Now, that might sound kind of ridiculous because it's so commonplace today, but it's actually true. Things have obviously changed since then, but we still use email as one of our primary dissemination methods for all of our content. We use social media, and of course we have the website, which everything points to and where everything is housed. And as I mentioned, everything is for free. But a mailing list lets us reach specific people. e-flux is not a media platform in the conventional sense. We are also, in that sense, more about quality than quantity. We are not just after clicks. This has allowed us to maintain our editorial integrity. We are independent. We were founded by an artist, and we continue to be run by artists and architects. And if you want to really get a sense of what we do, go to our website, but I would also really recommend subscribe to our mailing list. It's great. But what is it that we actually publish? We primarily publish two different types of content, which is mirrored in the design of our website. We publish essays by leading practitioners, researchers, theorists, and historians working in and around architecture, and we publish announcements, which is basically news about different events happening all around the world, like exhibition openings, call for applications, new research initiatives, publications, biennials, etc. With both of these types of content, e-flux architecture is, if I have to humbly argue, one of the best ways to understand what is actually happening in the field of architecture at large today. It is also an archive of what has happened over the past 10 years. Now, we don't publish everything. Again, we're not a traditional media organization, and we don't have information about everywhere. As you can see, the announcements that we publish do primarily come from the global north, but it's not limited to it. And while our announcements, which are our primary form of revenue, this is maybe also why it comes from the global north, Our essays and our projects make up for that by engaging with thematics, practitioners, and discourses coming from and relevant to the Global South. So I don't want to go into announcements so much. They are what they are. I want to speak about essays, which are all commissioned and published within the framework of projects. So each project, and we've done over 60 so far, is dedicated to a specific theme and is done in collaboration with institutional partners. Could be curators, could be researchers, could be anything. So I want to speak about a few of these projects briefly to show the type of work that we do. But I also, in so doing, I want to kind of offer an homage, actually, to where we are and the relationship that has been longstanding between e-flux architecture and the GSA. As I mentioned, I've been lucky enough to work with a number of people who have either worked here or studied at or around the GSA over the years, and I want to highlight some of those instances. So our first project was Superhumanity. It was launched in 2016, and it was done in collaboration with Mark Wigley and Beatrice Colomina for the 3rd Istanbul Design Biennial. The initial run featured a total of 40 essays rethinking what we know about and what it means to be human. We started with an essay by Boris Groys exploring his concept of self-design, or the ways in which in the contemporary kind of attention economy, we increasingly design ourselves. And he looked at this in this essay, particularly in relation to narcissism. And we ended with an essay by Thomas Keenan on the political history of the definition of the human and the way the human has been used towards emancipatory struggles. Along the way, we featured essay by the likes of A.L. Weissman, Leslie Loco, Pellentan, and more. We published these 40 essays in a book, which I actually have donated to the school. So again, you can see it online, but also if you want to see the book, it's now in the new or growing library of the GSA. Another project we did a couple years later was called Monument. It was a collaboration with the New Institute, back then Het Nieuwe Institute in Rotterdam, and the Berlage Postgraduate Study Center for Study in Delft in 2020. It sought to respond to the recently emerging debate surrounding the contemporary legacy of historical monuments, as well as the renewed debate on what it means to monumentalize something. So this project was combined with a public program, a series of events that took place in Rotterdam, which included presentations by, among others, Mpho Matsipa. It also featured a number of newly commissioned videos, not just essays, including by the likes of Sumaya Valley, Dima Sruji, Quincy Gario, Milika Tomic, and more. Survivance was a project that we did in collaboration with the Guggenheim Museum in New York, early 2021. This was quite special for us in that usually we ourselves are directly in dialogue with institutional partners, and we kind of collaboratively come up with a list of contributors. But here we kind of decentralize the agency of this project a bit. It was a very large project, around 35 to 40 contributions, and we invited a series of co-editors to edit the project with us. And some of the co-editors included Nachi Blue Barnes, Black Quantum Futurism, Lindsay Bremner, Leslie Loco again, and Amba J. Seppi. This project looked at ways that communities around the world have found ways to not just survive, but thrive in spite of conditions of oppression. The word survivance was coined by an Anishinaabe, a Native American scholar. It featured contributions by Tandy Lowenson, Leslie Green, Gloria Pavita, Huda Tayob, Ajoa Arma, and many more. This is where I'm kind of starting to give credit to some of the people in this room. Something a little bit more recent, In Common was a project from 2023 in collaboration with Arc and Rev in Bordeaux, in France, and the Chicago Architecture Biennial that looked at the many ways that people make cities. And this included contributions on recent social housing projects and communal housing projects to more kind of self-build, more informal ways of building the city. And this featured a contribution by Dele, who many of you had met, Huda Tayob again, Mawana Yohusi, and many more. I'm moving ahead now more recently, and I'm also getting the impression that this lecture will definitely not take an hour. It will probably be closer to half an hour. Let's see. Very recently, this Insurgent Geologies is a collaboration that we did with the curators of the British Pavilion at the 2025 Venice Architecture Biennale.
This was Owen Hopkins, Kate Burrow, and Catherine Usalt.
It featured a series of dialogues on the way that geology, soil, earth, ground, and land have contributed over the past, present, and future to emancipatory struggles. And among others, it featured contributions by Wumi, Nana Biama Ofosu, Bonolo, who I'm not sure is here, Akil Memembe, and many others. Also recently, we collaborated with the curators of the Swiss Pavilion for a project called, yeah, I'm just kind of going down the line here. The curators of the Swiss Pavilion of the 2025 Venice Architecture Biennale, and departing from the work of Lisbeth Sachs, an underrepresented Swiss female architect, it looked at the ways that forgotten or suppressed histories and archives can resonate and resurface in the present, and it featured contributions by, among others, Sani here. So if you want to know, so for all the students here who have been getting like feedback from these like random people, if you want to know more about the research, you can go online. I mean, of course, you can search their name, but if you want to engage with some of their research, you can check out these projects. So now to part 2 of my lecture, that hopefully gives you a bit of an introduction into I mean, I didn't go into the nature of any of the essays, but hopefully it gives you an impression of what we do and who we are as a platform, as an editorial project. So for part 2, I want to zoom in on this one particular project that we are going to bring to Johannesburg as an exhibition next June. So Chronograms of Architecture is a project that we at e-flux Architecture have been doing since 2023 together with the Jenks Foundation in London. Technically now it's called the Cosmic House, the Jenks Foundation at the Cosmic House in London. Chronograms of Architecture is a project that critically interprets the legacy and methods of the architectural writer, educator, and historian Charles Jenks. Now, I've heard from Heidi that at least for all the students here, that everyone is probably somewhat familiar with Charles Jenks, but to varying degrees and maybe not at all. So I'm going to start by introducing a little bit in my own way who Charles Jenks is. In my opinion, he's most well known for 2 things. The first was declaring the death of modern architecture. As he wrote in his 1977 book, The Language of Postmodern Architecture, quote, "Modern architecture died in St. Louis, Missouri on July 15th, 1972 at 3:32 p.m. or thereabouts, when the infamous Pruitt-Igoe scheme, or rather several of its slab blocks, were given the final coup de grace by dynamite." The second thing he's most well known for is making this diagram, or this series of diagrams, which he called evolutionary trees, but which we call chronograms. Now, the evolutionary tree is a drawing. It's not quite a diagram. It's also not quite a map. It's a little bit of both. But what it does is it charts out the history and the future of the architecture field at large. It was made in response to the histories that many modern historians of architecture, like Nicholas Pevsner and Rainer Banham, who was actually his PhD supervisor, wrote. Jenks claimed that the histories these historians wrote were biased, that they had blind spots, that they were based on myth. He wanted to aim for something that was more inclusive, a more holistic story, one that celebrated diversity and was able to acknowledge difference, interdisciplinarity, and the cultural context in which architecture is produced. Now, while the history that Jenks wrote and drew was arguably more inclusive and more significantly acknowledged difference, it was still largely made from a white Western male perspective, and from the position of a Eurocentric understanding of history. Jenks himself had blind spots, many blind spots. He admitted to these and was cognizant of them. Now, we may be able to understand these kind of white spots, these white voids on the map, as a nod to the fact that this is not complete. This is not a complete picture. But this is also really one of the starting points of our project of Chronograms of Architecture, to look at what has been left out. But it is also to reinterpret the form, the logic, and what was actually a very unconventional practice of drawing history. Now, we believe in this method, in this format. It can be a very powerful means of critique and empowerment. But before going further into that, I want to explain more what this diagram is. So, Jenks started working at the time of two important philosophical movements in the history of Western philosophy: structuralism and semiotics. Jenks' work was initially informed by Claude Lévi-Strauss's structural analysis, which identified components of cultural phenomena and their opposites, crucially, as a way of presenting a more holistic view of things. So what Jenks did was he set up a three-point axis, or a pair of themes, which he felt could structure all architectural inclinations. The three-point axis, split into 6 pairs, are idealist versus activist, intuitive versus logical, self-conscious versus unself-conscious, or here, unself-conscious. These 6 categories remained relatively consistent throughout the development of Jenks's evolutionary trees, practice he did from the beginning of the 1970s until he died, basically. Now, these titles point to the motivating factor behind architects' work. For example, if they are driven by an idealist image of what architecture can be versus an activist urgency, or if they are driven by an intuitive artistic sensibility or a hard logical framework. The self-conscious tradition includes defined movements such as Beaux-Arts or classical, while the unself-conscious tradition, or as he would later write, 80% of the environment, is one that architects rarely inhabit, but where most built form emerges. Again, the kind of Eurocentrism kind of seeps through, right? Now, part of his inspiration was an amazing collection of historians who have diagrammed history. This actually goes way back. It goes back even to genealogical trees. But in architecture, a couple obvious references are the ones by Bannister Fletcher and Alfred Barr. Sorry. Fletcher's diagram on the left is called the Tree of Architecture. It references an older diagram called The Evolution of Man by Ernest Haeckel. Both diagrams have a metaphor of the tree, the strength and the progress of growth upwards and onwards via a sturdy main trunk, while lower branches shrivel and die. This is especially the reference point for Fletcher, was explicitly a form of social Darwinism, and Haeckel has been criticized for contributing to the emergence of the Nazi ideology in Germany. For Barr's diagram on the right, on the cover of his book on Cubism and abstract art, is a slightly more playful network of influences and confluences. However, it is still a very didactic and a reductivist view, focusing on the direct influence between styles, where all roads lead to the inevitable success of a contemporary style. Now, Charles was very cognizant of both of these references, as well as a host of others. He learned from them and their mistakes. He was also trying to disrupt their simplistic narratives and produce a more holistic zeitgeist view. So this is actually the first of Jenks's evolutionary trees, which was part of his PhD thesis, which was submitted to the Bartlett School of Architecture in 1970. The 3 pairs of terms are here on the left, they're printed small, and different decades are on the top. It's a bit like a timeline. I mean, it is a timeline, actually. And this is one of the key distinguishing features of these drawings. They map time. They show how things evolve, not just what things are, but where they are and where they're going. The pairs on the left are also positioned as far away from each other as possible to allow the maximum distance between them. And you'll notice that significant political, social, economic, and cultural movements are in large print, and they act as kind of attractors to a huge melange of different types of architecturally related terms: movements, architects, styles, cities, historians, technologies, associations, buildings, and more. Now, as I mentioned, Charles was trying to map change and evolution. He was asking questions like, where did new ideas come from? How did dominant moments in history merge and overlap with adjacent ideologies? you can notice here quite clearly how utopian ideologies effectively die out with the rise of the self-conscious fascist ideologies, only to return later on with Puck. Now, again, this is a very Eurocentric view of history. But like I said, Charles himself was suitably critical and self-aware of the limitations of his attempt at capturing world history. It was challenged by being, in his own words, quote unquote, two-dimensional, schematic, incomplete, with personal bias, Western bias, incomplete labels, subjective binaries, and simplifications. So what he did, perhaps because of this or in spite of this, is he constantly reworked, revised, adapted, and rethought this drawing. What also happened was that this method allowed Jenks to speculate, to not just look back at history, but in doing so, peer into the future. This was the first time the diagram was published in public form in architectural design in October of 1970. And you can see how already, right after his PhD, the history being drawn starts in 1920, but it goes to year 2000. Now, part of Charles's reasoning and motivations for creating this diagram, rather than writing history, crucially, the value of drawing, was to see if the graphic form could indicate how history might evolve, to even offer prediction of the architecture to come. Charles himself wrote, "The main point of conserving scenarios is to make one more aware of alternatives and thus active in shaping events. Why else predict? The objectives must be able to accentuate choice, either to bring about a trend or to suppress it, to mobilize opinion for or against a likely scenario." So here it is again in 1971, published as a poster by the AA. The colors are very pop-inspired. This was inspired in part by Archigram, who was teaching at the AA at the same time. And you could actually compare this to some of their Instant City drawings, and they're almost identical. But so I just want to mention again that Charles was constantly moving things around. Now, even though things may look very fixed in their place on the diagram, it can be very, I don't know, it has a lot of weight to place someone's name in a time, in a particular movement. But their fixity wasn't really the case. Every iteration he made, and as I have shown and I will continue to show, he made a lot. He would update this to update his current understandings of the field, and also to track how people have changed. Names would sometimes be repeated. Architects might have moved from one category in one decade to another. So this actually shows that. And he was aware of his own biases. Some of these architects were just his favorite, right? He really liked Frank Lloyd Wright. He really liked Le Corbusier. He really liked Mies. And so, you could see how things would move around, that not everything is as fixed as it might look. But he also experimented a lot with the form of these diagrams, the structure of the diagram, how different information is represented and brought together. So now I'm just going to kind of run through a lot of the iterations he did, just to give an impression of the formal variation that he experimented with. So this is from 1984. Don't know exactly when this one is from. This one is from 1981. And you can see sometimes they're more specific. It's not the entire history of architecture, it's specific movements. This one's from 1996. And what's interesting, so Charles Jenks, I guess the third thing he's most well known for is maybe at the top of the two things that I mentioned. He is the primary historian and theorist of postmodernism, of the kind of explosion of styles, and the kind of chaos that emerged after the canon and the constraints of modernism. But what's interesting is here now, in 1996, kind of reflecting on the evolution of the past years, you can see these kind of marks of differentiation kind of disappearing. Everything kind of just kind of molds into one organic blob, which in his idea was postmodern. Right? So these are more examples. He worked with portraits sometimes. Here's another very recent, like a later example. And so he he kind of got in like this diagramming delirium, right? He would just constantly be making these things. And so, this kind of leads us to where we are. I mean, Charles passed away a number of years ago. And, so what our project does is it engages with the legacy of his diagrams, and it reinterprets and recontextualizes his methods for today. And now, I mean, I need to mention, so he was making his diagrams up until the year 2003 or 4 or something. But already, like, this diagram, like, I hope you've seen this, but I'm also not surprised if you've seen this diagram. It had a major effect on the field of architecture, or at least the Western kind of post-canonical, canonical, field of architecture. It shaped the development of architectural culture really since it was made. A number of practitioners have also reinterpreted these diagrams and these methods. Most notably, I would say Alejandro Zarapolo and WAI Architecture Think Tank. But so our project kind of comes maybe within this tradition of reinterpreting. So since 2023, when we started, what we've done is we've commissioned architectural practitioners, designers, historians, researchers, to create new chronograms, ones that reckon with the historical moment that we live in today, that try and maybe make sense of where we are, how we got here, and where we might be going. Now, none can possibly present a total account. As hard as Charles did, he tried, he failed in that way. And we don't try to do that. But what each of these do is they reveal critical and urgent ways of seeing, of understanding, and working in the architectural culture of the present. So some of these diagrams that we've commissioned can be seen maybe to fill in the undulating blobs of white, while others take a whole new view altogether on architectural discourse. And like Jenks, whose loose metaphor of overlapping streams and a tree structure was actually very essential to his diagrams. He never understood this just as an indexed information. They were always designed as images that were meant to be observed and engaged with in graphic ways. So each of the diagrams that we've commissioned, also, they don't rely solely on information and indexicality, but also in their own way on form and image. So now I'm going to basically just run through the work that we've commissioned, and that will, I guess, bring us to the end. So this is a chronogram by Mold, which is an architectural collective working on on kind of critical urgencies surrounding climate, including, among others, Tatiana Schneider and Jeremy Till. So what they did in this project, Architecture as Climate, is they kind of rejected the linear view of time. The linear view of time that they made is the accumulation of carbon in the atmosphere. And what they did is they took a cross-section of the present. And instead of mentioning or identifying individual architects or names or practices, what they did is they looked at the ideologies, the concepts that are motivating the destruction of our planet. And by using the geological metaphor of this is a cross-section of a mountain, they were heavily inspired by Alexander von Humboldt's sectional drawings. They also identified these cracks, these fissures that might provide, openings or lines of flight towards a more, let's say, a more climate-friendly future. Sorry, this is a heavy drawing. This is Base and Superstructure, a vulgar survey of Western architecture by Pier Vittorio Relli and Marcin Corby. So they kind of rejected words almost as much as possible, and they took a kind of Marxist view looking at base and superstructure as looking at the conditions that shape architectural practice, looking at different, let's say, economic systems, from agriculture to rent to colonialism to slavery to capitalism, and looking at the architectural impact that has both in elevation, in plan, but also on subjectivity. Sometimes we might think of, the architect as a heroic person, but today architects are actually quite precarious. So they map the embodiment of ideologies within the architectural profession. The Feminist Spatial Practices Part 1 is a diagram by Brian E. Roberts and Abriana Aiken that looked at the polyphony of different forms of feminist spatial practice that might relate to architecture, but go well beyond. They looked at books, they looked at social movements, they looked at architectural practice, but they really looked at, beyond architecture, they looked at spatial practice. And they set this in a topographic metaphor. You can almost read this like a topographic map. And in the depressions, you see the water coming in gray, and these are the forces that might be fighting against or eating away at feminist emancipation. This is part 1. There was a part 2. We were very happy to kind of start a project that had a life afterwards. This was a very collaborative, participatory project. Part 2, this in another form lives online. It is an archive that has been growing, and you yourselves, if you want, you can contribute to it. This is the work called Cul-de-sac by Francesca Hughes and Artsy Grau. So they looked at the state of architectural education and kind of, they felt that the state of architectural education is effectively in a space where time does not exist, where there is no possibility of understanding or seeing a future. So they were looking here at the over-bureaucratization of architectural education, and looking at this as a, of course, they found some thing in the archive where Charles Jenks made a diagram like this, but they also really employed this with humor and comedy. They were looking at terms that maybe come from, corporate management structures that have kind of seeped into architectural culture and have now, unfortunately, come to define the pedagogical structures and the labor practices that many of us are forced to live within. This is a short but believable history of the digital turn in architecture by Mario Carpo with David Garcia and Steve Hutt. So this is as it kind of mentions, it's a diagram of the emergence and the increasing digitalization of architectural culture. But you can see here there's kind of an implicit argument, which I challenged the artists on, and they weren't really able to respond to. But there's almost like a kind of inevitability here, right? Of in the fact that it arranges itself not so much in a series of streams, but really just as a kind of bar graph. It has an accumulative logic of digital technologies. And, according to this, it's like there's no going back. It's only more and more and more and more. And the last commission from our kind of first batch, this is actually one of the diagrams that is part of the project visualizing the racial epistemologies of the architectural canon, by Charles Davis and Curry Hackett. So this diagram in particular, it rejected the linearity of time in Charles's diagram and looked more at, so their project as a whole looked at generally the appropriation and the increasing racialization of aesthetic discourse within architecture. And so here, kind of modeled on, on the slave ship, they looked at different elements of African culture that have been appropriated and incorporated into Western artistic and architectural traditions. Other diagrams in this series looked at the ways that architectural history and architectural theory, even like the language and the terminology, has become racialized and deracialized, the ebb and flow. So these first 6 diagrams, they were first published online, as everything we do, but they were also exhibited at the Architectural Association in 2023. And you can see here in this photograph of the exhibition, we did not just present the works. The works, often in the process of becoming an exhibition, they became materialized, right? I mean, this is what a lot of you students are working with now. How do you materialize an idea? How do you make something real that starts out as digital? But we also presented on this central table an archive of of Charles's diagrams to, as I did kind of in this lecture, give access to the wealth of Charles's practice and not just as one image. So here you can see some of the other diagrams by Charles and Curry. And actually, instead of the main diagram that I showed, they created kind of 3D models of the slave ship in kind of an exploded axonometric. The digital turn was represented in a video, and the feminist spatial practice had started kind of growing spores, and they kind of created this tufted carpet. So a couple years later, we commissioned a couple more. I should mention the Chronograms of Architecture. It is an ongoing project. This is not a static exhibition that we are just bringing, that we made and then we're bringing to places, but talk about that more. So in 2025, we commissioned 2 new diagrams. This one, called Circular Design Principles Between Theory and Practice, was by a group of researchers led by Lionel de Vlieger, who is one of the founders of Rotor, the Brussels-based practice who kind of pioneered reuse in the West. And they looked at the ways that ideas of circularity, of reuse, of sustainability have existed for a very long time, but they have existed both in theory and practice, and how those two things, they don't always often match up with each other. So looking at kind of the difference between these. And then this work, Chronogram of Chronograms on Disciplinarity by Maria Fedorchenko and Yeliz Abdulrahman, looked at the way that the discipline of architecture understands itself. It looked at the ways that it basically diagrammed architectural history, not architecture. And so it looked at different books, different works that have, in their argument, made themselves chronograms. They've charted the development of architectural culture over time, and they kind of diagrammed it, they splayed it around this kind of all-engulfing black hole. And so the original 6 plus the 2 new diagrams were exhibited this year? Yeah, my God, that's still this year. This year at SIVA in Brussels. Again, you can see that there's kind of a similar motif where you have this kind of central table with archival material surrounded by this material. But like I said, there's a process of transformation that often happens when going from digital to print or to real. This is the mold diagram that became a tapestry thanks to an invitation from the International Architecture Biennale of Rotterdam. And this is the circularity diagram printed on a reused window. We started, as we start all these exhibitions, with a symposium where we invite the people who have made the diagrams to explain their work in greater detail. I'll give a greater introduction to the project, but also bring new voices in and create conversations and around this practice of diagramming history. So as I mentioned, this is an ongoing project. I am incredibly happy and excited that we are coming to Johannesburg and that we can bring this discussion, this debate, and to learn from the community here at the GSA. This is a project that is aiming to circle the world. It will go on for probably the next 7 years, and we're going to be kind of accumulating and commissioning new work along the way. For the Johannesburg exhibition, we have commissioned Nana Biama Ofosu to make a chronogram of African diasporic practice, and we have commissioned Ilse Wolf to create a diagram of emancipatory spatial practices. So I hope you will all join us next year for the exhibition opening. But even if not, maybe you'll catch the project somewhere else along the way. But yeah, thank you very much. I'm very excited to bring this here.